Mother died today, or maybe yesterday. I don't know. That's how one of the most read novels of the 20th century begins, with a line that throws even the simplest things into disorder. Like knowing what day it is, like remembering the exact order in which things happened. Have you ever felt that distance between what you actually feel and what you're supposed to feel in front of other people? That invisible wall separating you from the people around you, not because you're better or worse than they are, but because you seem to be made of some different material. Different in a way that isolates you, not in a way that makes you stand out or impresses anyone. That specific feeling is the central theme of this short novel, written by a man named Albert Camus. The book is called The Stranger. To understand why that wall exists, you first have to understand the concept Camus spent much of his life developing. A concept he didn't invent out of nowhere, but one he named with almost surgical, almost clinical precision. He called it the absurd. The absurd, in Camus' philosophy, doesn't mean something ridiculous or illogical, the way we use the word in everyday speech. When we say a line at the bank is absurd, or some rule is absurd, it means something else, something more precise. A collision between two forces that never fit together. On one side, there's you, an animal born programmed to ask why. Why work 8 hours a day? Why love someone who's going to die sooner or later? Why bother with any project that isn't going to last forever? On the other side is the universe, which simply doesn't answer. Not because it's hiding the answer somewhere out of reach. It has no answer to give at all. It isn't deliberate indifference. It's structural silence. The absurd is born exactly at the meeting point between those two things, the relentless human question and the permanent cosmic silence. Camus developed this idea in more depth in an essay called The Myth of Sisyphus, published in 1942. The same year, The Stranger hit French bookshelves. The two books were almost twins, one philosophical, direct, argumentative, the other narrative, dry, almost clinical in the way it lays out the facts. But both are trying to say exactly the same thing through different paths. This collision doesn't only show up in dramatic moments, like a funeral or a tragedy. It also shows up in the smaller details of the modern routine, details so small they usually go unnoticed. It shows up in the bluish glow of your phone reflected on your face at 2 in the morning, when you should already be asleep, but you keep scrolling for no real reason, just to put off the silence of an empty room. It shows up in traffic, stopped dead on some highway, engine running, radio on, while you mentally calculate how many hours of your own life have already been spent in that exact kind of pointless waiting. It shows up in the credit card statement that lands in your inbox at the end of the month, summing up, in cold numbers, an entire month of decisions, sacrifices, and small purchased joys. None of these scenes is tragic on its own, but added together, they form the exact backdrop where this absurd shows up most often, not in some great disaster, but in the repetition of an ordinary day with no final explanation big enough to justify the effort it took to live it. This need for meaning you carry around didn't come from nowhere, and it isn't some personal flaw of yours. It has concrete historical roots, built up over many centuries of Western civilization. For a very long time, the standard answer to why was God. You're born, you suffer, you love, you grow old, and you die. And all of it has a purpose, because there's a bigger plan. An invisible author of history who knows the reason behind every chapter, even when you can't see it yourself. That answer held up entire empires, entire cathedrals, entire legal systems for more than 1,000 years. Then came the objective moral theories. A slightly quieter promise, but just as powerful. There's a right and a wrong etched into the very structure of reality, something you can discover through enough reasoning, almost like discovering a law of physics by watching the sky closely. Medieval philosophers like Thomas Aquinas tried, centuries earlier, to fuse those two promises into one, arguing that reason itself, properly exercised, led right back to God, closing the perfect circle between faith and logic. Then came the Enlightenment, in the 18th century, with its most ambitious promise of all. Human reason would be capable of explaining everything, organizing everything, predicting everything, solving everything, given enough time and the right method. Thinkers like Descartes, Kant, and later the 19th century positivists, Auguste Comte among them, bet on reason's almost unlimited ability to replace God's old role as the source of certainty. Science, industry, and technical progress seemed, at that point, capable of delivering a secular version of that same old promise, an understandable destiny, a clear direction for all of humanity. It's worth noting that Camus wasn't alone in this effort. An entire generation of European thinkers, shaped between the two world wars, dedicated themselves to rethinking how human life could sustain any kind of value after 2 decades of trenches, concentration camps, and entire cities reduced to rubble. This broad movement, which came to be known loosely as existentialism, brought together thinkers with very different answers from one another, but all starting from a similar diagnosis. The old structures of meaning, religious, moral, or rational, hadn't survived the 20th century intact, and something new needed to be thought through from the wreckage without pretending the cracks weren't there. Camus wrote well after these 3 promises had already started cracking visibly. He lived through the 20th century from the inside, not as some distant reader of history books, but as a direct witness. The Second World War, the Nazi occupation of France, the extermination camps discovered at the end of the conflict, the atomic bomb dropped on 2 Japanese cities in 1945. A century in which it grew harder and harder to claim there's a divine plan wisely organizing all of it, or that reason alone, no matter how sophisticated, would solve humanity's gravest problems. It was in exactly this landscape of shattered promises, in the middle of the literal and figurative smoke of war, that he sat down to write his most important texts. A brief biographical note helps here. Who this man was while he was writing. Camus was born in 1913 into a poor family in French Algeria, the son of a farm labourer who died in the First World War, and an illiterate, nearly deaf mother who supported the household by cleaning houses. He grew up in a working-class neighbourhood of Algiers, with no books at home, and only got access to reading because a public school teacher noticed his talent and pushed his family to let him continue his studies. Later, as an adult, he became directly involved in the French resistance against the Nazi occupation, even secretly editing the newspaper Combat during the most dangerous years of the war. He didn't write about the absurd as some purely academic exercise, detached from his own life. He wrote as someone who had watched firsthand how inherited certainties could crumble in the face of hunger, poverty, and real violence. And here's the point that changes everything. When these traditional sources of meaning lose their grip, something strange and uncomfortable happens. Human beings don't stop asking. You keep needing a reason. You keep waking up in the morning expecting, even without admitting it out loud, that the day has some greater direction than just getting through your tasks. Except now, the question leaves your mouth and finds nothing on the other end. No voice, no echo. You ask why keep going, and the universe gives back exactly the same silence it would give a rock. That mismatch, asking and hearing no answer at all, is exactly what Camus calls the absurd. And that same experience, stretched out and turned into routine, is what you recognize as loneliness. Not necessarily the loneliness of being physically alone in an apartment, the loneliness of asking why and getting no answer from anyone, not from the sky, not from the universe, not from anyone around you who seems to truly grasp the size of what you're feeling. There's a scene Camus himself describes, right in the opening pages of The Myth of Sisyphus, that captures well the exact moment the absurd shows up in ordinary life. He talks about a man who follows the same routine, day after day, week after week, year after year, wakes up, takes the same transit, does the same job, eats at the same table, sleeps, and starts over, until, one day, for no apparent reason, this man asks himself why. And it's exactly at that moment, according to this account, that everything starts to fall apart, because the automatic machinery that had been holding up the routine stops working the second the question is asked out loud, even if it's only inside his own head. Before that moment, living was a habit. After it, living becomes a choice that needs justifying. And it's exactly that demand for justification that the universe's silence refuses to answer. Literature, by the way, had already looked into this same void long before Camus. In The Myth of Sisyphus itself, there's a passage devoted to the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky, especially to characters like the narrator of Notes from Underground and the protagonist of Demons, figures who, decades earlier, already lived with that sense of being cut loose from traditional religious and moral explanations, unable to fit back into any of them. Camus' admiration was real for Dostoevsky's ability to describe that dislocation with almost clinical precision, though his disagreement was just as clear when it came to the final direction Dostoevsky gives many of these characters, who tend to find, by the end of the story, a path back to religious faith. That return, in Camus' reading, represented, once again, a way of backing away from the abyss instead of inhabiting it consistently to the end. Camus wasn't the first philosopher to notice this gap between the question and the silence. Before him, two other thinkers had already stared into the same abyss and proposed radically different ways out. Getting to know both of them carefully helps make sense of everything that follows, because Camus built almost his entire body of thought by answering point by point these two traditions, too. The first way out comes from a 19th century Dane named Søren Kierkegaard, considered by many historians of philosophy to be the direct forerunner of existentialism, even though he wrote almost a century before the term became popular. The son of a Copenhagen merchant, marked by deep religious guilt, Kierkegaard lived a short, fairly reclusive life, devoted almost entirely to writing, much of it published under different pseudonyms, each one representing a distinct stage of spiritual development that he himself described in detail. In works like Fear and Trembling, published in 1843, he realized almost a century before Camus that reason alone can't prove God's existence, nor guarantee any meaning for human life through a chain of logical arguments. Faced with that, Kierkegaard didn't abandon faith as you might expect. He proposed something more radical, a leap of faith. The idea is simple to grasp, even though it's hard to actually live. Since reason can't get you to God by any safe, step-by-step path, you have to leap past it, a decision to believe in spite of the absence of proof, not because of it. It isn't a logical conclusion, chained together like a theorem. It's a choice, made with your eyes wide open to the emptiness ahead, but you take the leap anyway, with no safety net underneath. A leap with no net. To illustrate this idea, Kierkegaard turns to the old biblical story of Abraham, instructed to sacrifice his own son Isaac as proof of faith. From a purely rational, moral, human standpoint, this request makes no sense at all. No known ethical framework would justify killing your own son. And yet, according to Kierkegaard, Abraham obeys, not because he understands the reason, not because he found some satisfying logical justification, but because he takes the leap of faith without understanding anything. It's exactly this kind of gesture, incomprehensible to pure reason, that Kierkegaard considers the true core of religious experience. Camus saw in this example, at once, one of the most honest descriptions and one of the most problematic solutions in all of Western philosophy, because it demands giving up the very faculty that, for him, defined what it means to be human, the need to understand before acting. Kierkegaard saw in this gesture the only honest form of reconciliation with the divine, in a world where reason alone could no longer sustain faith the way it used to. The second way out comes from a completely different corner of the philosophical map. Friedrich Nietzsche, the late 19th century German philosopher, became known for a line that's often misread out of context. God is dead. He wasn't making a statement about astronomy, and he wasn't announcing some scientific fact. He was describing something closer to a cultural diagnosis. Western civilization had, little by little, stopped truly believing in the structures that used to give everything automatic meaning, even while people kept going to church and going through the motions out of habit. And for Nietzsche, this wasn't cause for despair. It was, on the contrary, an opening. If the old sources of value had died, It was up to each individual to create new values, without leaning on external foundations, without waiting for permission from any authority above them, divine, political, or social. In works like Thus Spoke Zarathustra and The Gay Science, Nietzsche describes a kind of human being capable of saying yes to their own life by creating its meaning on their own, like an artist sculpting existence out of their own vital drive. He calls this type of person, provocatively, the overman, someone capable of bearing even the heaviest idea Nietzsche can imagine, that everything you live through, every detail, every pain, every joy, will repeat itself, exactly the same, an infinite number of times, forever. According to him, only a human being who has already forged their own values solidly enough can say yes to that eternal repetition without falling apart. Too heavy for most people to carry. The best-known image of this idea appears in a short passage from The Gay Science, known as the Parable of the Madman, published back in 1882. In it, a man runs through the marketplace early in the morning, shouting that he's looking for God, and met with the laughter of the people there, people who no longer believe in God, but haven't yet grasped the consequences of that. He announces that God is dead, and that we're the ones who killed him, with our own hands. The man then asks, out loud, how humanity is going to bear the weight of that news, since wiping out the entire horizon of meaning that God represented also means wiping out any fixed point of reference, up or down, forward or back. It's exactly that vacuum, felt almost physically by this character in the marketplace, that Nietzsche proposes to fill with the individual creation of values, and that Camus, decades later, would consider not enough. Nobody knew what to do with that news. Camus read both thinkers seriously, almost reverently, and still rejected both of them. That rejection doesn't come from contempt. It comes from an internal consistency that's hard to get around. According to him, both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are, at bottom, doing the same thing, just by opposite paths. Both are trying to fill the hole opened up by the absurd. One fills it with faith, the other fills it with self-created values, with willpower, with individual self-assertion. But both, in Camus' reading, are running from the void instead of looking straight at it and continuing to live without ever fully filling it in. For Camus, this move of filling in the gap is a kind of philosophical suicide, a strong term he uses on purpose. You kill the original question, instead of learning to live alongside it, open, without a final answer, day after day, year after year, until the natural end of your own life. There's a name that comes up almost every time Camus' name does, Jean-Paul Sartre, with whom he was actually close friends in Paris during the war years. The two tend to show up together on lists of existentialists, but Camus himself publicly rejected that label for himself, and the difference isn't just a matter of academic vanity. Sartre argued that human existence is free in an almost absolute sense, with each person left to build their own essence from scratch, with no limits set in advance. Camus, for his part, kept a firmer footing in the idea of the absurd as a real limit, something that doesn't fully dissolve through individual choice, no matter how free that choice is. The friendship between the two ended publicly and painfully in 1952, after Sartre harshly criticized Camus' next book, The Rebel, published in 1951, precisely because of this underlying disagreement over freedom, political revolution and violence. Hold on to these two names, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, because they'll come back later once this video reaches Meursault and the Rock of Sisyphus, and you'll see exactly why both of those exits had to be ruled out before Camus could propose his own. Understanding philosophy is interesting. Practicing philosophy can change your life. Start with the link I've pinned in the first comment. If Camus rejects the two most influential exits Western philosophy offers for the problem of meaning, the obvious question remains, so what do you do? He posed that question to himself directly and arrived at three possible responses to the absurd. He firmly rejects the first two. The third he adopts as the only genuinely coherent stance. It's worth going through all three slowly. because chances are each one has crossed your mind at some difficult moment in your life, even without you having this philosophical vocabulary handy at the time. The first possible response is fleeing into belief. Faced with the anguish of having no guaranteed answer, someone clings to something that hands back meaning artificially and instantly. A religion lived with no room left for real doubt. A political ideology treated as absolute, unquestionable truth. Some cause that promises to resolve the void once and for all, with no further thinking required afterward. Camus isn't attacking faith itself, and he isn't claiming every religion is disguised weakness. He's describing a specific, recognizable move, using a belief as anesthesia, as a way to stop thinking instead of continuing to think through the discomfort. In the essay itself, Camus extends this critique to other philosophers too, not just to religions. Thinkers who, after recognizing the absurdity of existence, invent a ladder back up that their own reasoning had already knocked down a few pages earlier. A retreat from the abyss, which he labels with deliberate irony. A step backward, dressed up as progress. This flight has plenty of very current versions, outside traditional religious vocabulary. Some people fill the void with an extreme productivity routine, treating every minute of the day as if it were in service of some greater, unquestionable mission, never once allowing themselves to ask what all that rushing is actually for. Others fill that same void by devoting their entire lives to a political cause treated as ultimate truth, immune to any internal questioning, where disagreeing already counts as betrayal. In every one of these cases, the psychological mechanism is similar. The belief works like a ready-made answer, delivered right out of the box, sparing the person the discomfort of having to keep asking on their own. There's an even more recent variation, tied to self-help and wellness culture, that promises the universe responds in exact proportion to the positive energy you put out, as if all it took was thinking right to get a friction-free life back in return. Camus never encountered this specific vocabulary, coined decades after his death, but the mechanism he describes applies point for point, swapping the universe's real silence for a comforting narrative of cosmic cause and effect is just one more way of filling the void with a ready-made answer, instead of learning to walk alongside the question that has no answer at all. The second possible response is more serious. Ending your own existence in the face of realizing that no answer coming from outside guarantees a purpose. Right in the opening pages of The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus goes so far as to say, there's only one truly serious philosophical problem, deciding whether life is or isn't worth living. This exit, though, is rejected outright. It isn't a logical conclusion drawn from the absurd, it's a flight from it. Ending your existence doesn't resolve the question. It just erases the person who was asking it. The effect should actually run in the opposite direction from despair. If life doesn't come with a built-in purpose, then every minute lived stops being a stepping stone towards some future reward and starts being worth something on its own in the present. And that same logic applies to the smaller, quieter versions of this flight too. Any strategy that erases the presence of the one asking the question instead of keeping the question alive. If this topic hits close to home for you, in a way that goes beyond philosophical reflection into something real and current, it's worth remembering that mental health support lines are available any hour of the day, and talking to someone trained to listen can make a real, immediate difference that no book on its own can make. The third response is Camus's own proposal, and it's the only one he considers consistent with everything that came before in his argument. He calls it revolt. Not a violent revolt against the world, with raised fists and fiery speeches, but an internal, almost silent stance, living without appealing to any higher meaning, without a faith that resolves everything at once, without an ideology that explains every detail of existence, accepting with an open chest that there may in fact be no final answer for why you're alive, and, at the same time, refusing both nihilism, which says absolutely nothing matters, and so it doesn't matter what you do, and paralyzing despair, which either takes you out of life too soon or freezes you in place within it. It's a strange balance, almost impossible to hold for very long, and Camus knew that better than anyone. But it's exactly this unstable balance that he tries to describe throughout the whole work. Not as a state you reach once and for all, but as a tension that has to be renewed every day, almost like a physical exercise that loses its effect the moment you stop practicing it. This revolt has 3 practical consequences listed in the essay itself, and it's worth going through them carefully because they sound simple in theory, but actually change a lot about the daily behavior of anyone who takes them seriously. The first is revolt itself, keeping alive every day the awareness that there's no external guarantee of purpose, instead of letting that awareness drift off to sleep on the autopilot of routine. The second is freedom. Free not in the sense of being able to do anything without consequence, but free from the chains of a destiny predetermined by God, by the state, or by any ideology that claims to know in advance the correct script for your life. The third is passion. Living the limited time available as intensely as possible, precisely because it's limited, not in spite of it. Taken together, these 3 consequences form the skeleton of an absurd life lived with coherence, without cheating and without giving up. In practice, this means continuing to invest in a long-term project, even knowing it could collapse for reasons outside your control. Continuing to build deep relationships, even knowing all of them will end, one way or another, someday. And continuing to pay real attention to the present, instead of treating it as just a stepping stone towards some uncertain future reward. And it's this turning point, this third response, that changes the direction of everything that follows in this video. Hold on to that word too, revolt, because it's about to explain both Meursault's behavior in the courtroom and Sisyphus's gesture as he walks back down the mountain empty-handed. Now come back with me to the beginning. The line about the mother, the uncertain day, the distance between what you truly feel and what other people expect you to feel in public. That scene is a paraphrase of the most famous opening in The Stranger, the novel Camus published in 1942, the same year as the essay on Sisyphus. The story is narrated in first person by Meursault, an ordinary office clerk living in Algiers, then part of colonial France in North Africa, who gets the news of his own mother's death right in the book's opening lines, in a dry, almost administrative tone that already sets the stage for everything that follows. The setting isn't a decorative detail. Camus grew up on that exact stretch of the Algerian coast, between the dry heat of the Mediterranean summer and the harsh light bouncing off the sea. And that specific landscape shows up almost obsessively across several of his writings, including more personal essay collections like Nuptials and Summer, written before and after his most famous novels. In that world, the Algerian sun isn't just a nice backdrop, it's almost a character. A physical force that clouds reason, that presses down on the head of anyone walking a beach at noon, and that, at the climax of The Stranger, plays a direct role in the very act of violence Meursault commits, blinded by the heat and by the light reflecting off a blade. In a moment when the decision seems to be born more out of a body exposed to its surroundings than out of any prior rational calculation. What makes Meursault so disturbing to the other characters isn't exactly the crime he commits later in the story. A killing carried out under the blazing sun of an Algerian beach. It's something earlier and more subtle. He doesn't cry at his own mother's funeral. He doesn't perform grief the way the people around him expect him to. He doesn't fake a sadness bigger than what he actually feels, and he doesn't fake one smaller either. And that, more than any concrete act of violence, is what makes him suspicious in the eyes of everyone around him, including the judge, who will later put him on trial. The same invisible wall described at the start of this video is the wall separating Meursault from the rest of the world inside the fiction itself. Throughout the book, he's judged less for what he actually did and more for who he refuses to pretend to be in front of others. This becomes even clearer in the second half of the novel, once Meursault takes the stand as the defendant. The prosecutor spends more of the trial reconstructing, witness by witness, his behavior at his mother's wake, weeks before the crime, than on the actual act of violence committed on the beach. The fact that Meursault smoked a cigarette near the coffin, that he drank coffee with milk during the vigil, that he couldn't remember his own mother's exact age when asked. All of it gets used in court as proof of a supposed moral coldness, treated by the jury as almost more damning than the killing he actually committed. Camus builds this scene on purpose, almost as a teaching moment, to show how the society described in the book is more interested in judging a person's emotional performance than in the objective facts in front of it. The parallel with more recent dynamics of public judgment isn't a stretch. Nowadays, all it takes is a short video, clipped out of context, showing someone reacting in a way considered inappropriate to some collective tragedy, for an entire crowd of strangers to decide, within a few hours, that person's whole moral character, based on a split second of observable behavior. The court that puts Meursault on trial didn't need social media to work this way. It was already operating, decades before the internet, on that same logic of turning an isolated gesture, pulled out of a complex emotional context, into definitive proof of an entire character. Within the story, Meursault represents exactly the philosophical proposal described earlier, living without appealing to a higher purpose, including, here, the social norm that there's a correct, universal way to grieve in public. He doesn't seek anyone's approval. He doesn't build elaborate justifications for his own behavior, neither before nor after the fact. He doesn't bend to expectations about how a grieving son should act, or how a model citizen should behave in front of the law and the court. This isn't performative rebellion, the kind that shouts loudly to be noticed and admired. It's something else, quieter, and for that very reason, more radical. The freedom to simply not play a role he doesn't feel is true on the inside. That same freedom has a much older mirror than any French courtroom, a Greek image with a real rock on its back, that closes out this video in a moment. Carry that same logic over to a phone screen, decades after the book's publication. There's an expectation today that's almost identical to the one that condemns Meursault, that every loss, every achievement, every opinion needs to come with a public display proportional to the size of the event, posted, commented on, validated with likes from people who often don't even know the full context of what they're judging. Someone who posts nothing in the face of a tragedy seems cold. Someone who posts too little seems careless. Someone who posts too much seems like they're performing. The ruler that measures how authentic a feeling is, oddly enough, stopped being the feeling itself and became instead how well it fits a format other people can recognize. Meursault, if he existed today, would probably get dragged online for posting absolutely nothing. This trait of Meursault's is often mistaken for emotional coldness, and it's worth carefully separating the two, because that confusion is common and worth clearing up. His indifference doesn't come from an inability to feel. It's a direct consequence of living without appealing to higher meanings that, to him, simply don't exist in any provable way. He doesn't fake importance where he doesn't see real importance, because to him, that would be a kind of lie told in public. There's a huge difference between apathy, which is a neurological or emotional inability to feel anything at all, and Meursault's lucid indifference, which is the conscious refusal to pretend to feel exactly what the social audience expects to see written on his face. You've probably felt a smaller version of this yourself. The pressure to show more enthusiasm at a birthday party, more sadness at a funeral, more outrage on social media than you actually feel inside, just so you don't get misread or judged by other people. That lucid indifference, though, isn't the same as total passivity toward life. Meursault works, keeps up relationships, helps his neighbors, feels pleasure, feels tired, reacts to the world around him with real attention. What he refuses isn't the experience itself, but the extra, mandatory layer of interpretation that society tries to stick on top of every experience, telling him, and telling anyone, exactly how they're supposed to feel about each event, at the right intensity, at the right moment, for the right duration. That specific refusal, and only that, is what Camus calls indifference. And that's exactly why it can coexist, without any contradiction, with a life that's sensorially rich and fully present. And there's another side to Meursault, less discussed in quick takes on the book, but just as important for understanding the philosophy behind him. Throughout the story, He places intense value on small, concrete physical experiences. The heat of the sun on his skin during the Algerian summer, the sound and smell of the sea, the satisfied exhaustion after swimming for hours, the smoke of a cigarette smoked slowly, the body of a woman lying next to his on some random afternoon. He doesn't judge these experiences as good or bad, high or low, worthy or unworthy of a grieving man. He simply lives them, with almost total attention to the immediate present, without apologizing for feeling physical pleasure in a world with no guarantee of any greater meaning. This appreciation for pure experience, with no moral framework laid out in advance, is one of the most practical implications of this whole absurdist philosophy. If there's no cosmic script telling you in advance what's worth feeling and what isn't, then every concrete, everyday sensation takes on a weight that used to be reserved only for grand religious or ideological purposes. The sun on your skin stops being an irrelevant detail and becomes, literally, a legitimate part of what a day can possibly mean. In the philosophical essay itself, Camus puts this idea even more directly, arguing that what matters isn't living better, in the traditional moral sense of virtue accumulated over the years, but living more, in the sense of experiencing the greatest possible amount of conscious present, without ranking these experiences as higher or lower than one another. It isn't about piling up pleasure in some hedonistic way, chasing one sensation after another without stopping. It's about attention, about actually being present during breakfast, during the commute to work, during some random conversation with a stranger in line at the grocery store, instead of moving through these moments on autopilot, waiting for real life to start at some more important point in the future. Now it's time to come back to another image, maybe the single most famous one in Camus' entire body of work, one capable of summing up decades of philosophical debate all on its own. It comes from an ancient Greek myth, retold in detail in the essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. According to the legend, recorded by ancient authors like Homer and picked up later by Ovid, Sisyphus was a king of the city of Corinth, punished by the Greek gods for his excessive cunning, for trying to cheat death itself more than once, even going so far as to chain up the god of death himself to keep any mortal from dying while the trick lasted. As eternal punishment for that audacity, he was condemned to push a massive rock to the top of a mountain, only to watch it roll back down the moment it got there, and then start over, forever. No official break, no final victory recorded anywhere, no moment when the task is actually and definitively finished. Before getting to Sisyphus, the essay itself spends a good part of the text on other figures it calls absurd heroes. People who, each in their own way, already live out this logic without needing an actual rock or an actual mountain. Camus brings up the stage actor who devotes his entire life to intensely living out characters he knows, from the very start, are going to end the moment the stage lights go out. He also brings up the figure of Don Juan, the seducer who chases one passion after another, not because he believes in any of them as some final destiny, but because he values the intensity of each encounter for what it is, without promising himself a forever he already knows, in advance, doesn't exist. These figures set the stage for Sisyphus, the most complete example of all, because with him, there's no character left, no conquest left, just pure effort, repeated without end. It becomes clearer if we pause for a moment on the example of the actor, because it helps make sense of the other two. Over the course of a single career, a stage actor can live out dozens of entirely different lives, each one ending for good the moment the play ends and the lights go out. He cries deaths that aren't his own, lives out loves that aren't his own, and knows from the very first rehearsal that all of it will dissolve the moment the curtain falls. And even so, a good actor doesn't hold anything back, doesn't save part of his own intensity to protect himself from the play's inevitable end. He gives himself over completely, knowing full well how it ends. And it's exactly that combination, total commitment plus full awareness of finitude, that stands as the truest portrait of what it means to live absurdly and coherently. Camus uses this image as a synthesis of everything built up throughout this video, from start to finish. An existence with no guaranteed external purpose. A repetition that leads nowhere outside itself, in a cycle that closes and opens again without stopping. It's an almost perfect portrait of the absurd itself, translated into rock, mountain, and slope. Many readers stop right at this point in the story and see nothing but pure tragedy, an eternal cruel punishment, a punishment with no purpose at all, the ultimate example of suffering stripped of any final redemption. But Camus takes a step beyond that first impression, and it's this step that carries the whole final turn of his thinking. He proposes, with an almost provocative calm, that Sisyphus can find meaning in the very act of pushing the rock, regardless of any external goal, regardless of whether the rock stays at the top for even a single second before rolling back down. The struggle itself becomes enough to justify its own existence. Not because that struggle leads to some final destination, but because it's the one piece of territory that truly belongs to Sisyphus in this whole story. The one piece of his life that no god, no judge, and no audience can rip away from him by force, no matter how hard they all try. One at a time. Across the centuries, this story keeps getting told. The word that comes up most to describe this stance is lucidity. Not courage, not optimism, not faith. Lucidity means keeping your eyes wide open exactly on the thing that would be easiest not to see, without closing your eyes to soften the real weight of the scene, and without trading that weight for some more comforting fantasy explanation, no matter how tempting that might be on a particularly bad day, the kind everyone has now and then. The mountain belongs to the gods who chose it as the stage for the punishment. The rock formally belongs to the punishment imposed from outside. But the exact way Sisyphus pushes it, the attention he chooses to give each step up the slope, the lucidity with which he faces the climb, knowing exactly what's going to happen again at the top, that's his, and only his, something no god can confiscate. That's why Camus ends the essay with one of the most quoted lines in all of 20th century philosophy, a synthesis that sums up decades of argument in a single gesture of calm courage. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, not a naive happiness that pretends not to see the real weight of the rock on his back. A lucid, trained happiness, one that looks straight at the infinite repetition, at the absence of any final victory recorded anywhere, at the emptiness of any justification beyond the effort itself, and still chooses to keep pushing with a dignity nobody from outside granted him, and that, therefore, nobody from outside has the power to take away from him afterward. There's a detail in this image that tends to get overlooked in quicker readings of the text, but it's worth noticing. The most interesting moment in the whole story isn't the climb with the rock on his back, it's the descent, the walk back down the mountain, empty-handed, knowing exactly what's waiting down there. It's during that interval, with no physical effort and no distraction at all, that Sisyphus is fully conscious of his own condition. The text calls this descent the hour of consciousness, the moment when Sisyphus could give himself over to despair, since nothing forces him to rush back down to start over. And it's exactly in that free interval, more than during the effort of the climb itself, that his attitude gets decided. Either he walks down defeated, counting the steps left until the next punishment, or he walks down lucid, almost serene, knowing the rock is his, the effort is his, and no god can take that ownership away from him. The invisible wall described at the start of this video doesn't disappear after all of this, as if a philosophical concept worked like an instant cure. It won't vanish tomorrow morning just because you understood today an argument from a French philosopher who's been dead for decades. But over time, it can change meaning when faced with the same lucidity Meursault brings to his own public trial, and Sisyphus brings to his own rock and his own mountain. You can stop waiting for someone, someday, to hand you the definitive answer for why you're alive. And instead, you can find some real tangible dignity in the simple act of continuing. Continuing to work, even with no absolute guarantee of a final reward. Continuing to love people who are also going to die one day, exactly like Meursault's mother died, exactly like everyone dies. Continuing to wake up, pushing your own particular rock, paying attention to the sun, the sea, the body, the concrete present in front of you, without apologizing to anyone else for it. The loneliness described at the start of this video might never completely disappear from your life, and it's quite likely it won't. But it can stop being read as a personal flaw of yours, a defect of character, and start being understood simply as the common condition of anyone lucid enough to ask the right question out loud. There's a final irony in Camus' own biography that might help bring this all together. In 1957, still relatively young, he received the Nobel Prize in Literature, officially recognized for shedding light, according to the committee, on the problems of human conscience in his time. 3 years later, in January of 1960, he died in an ordinary car accident on some random French road, with no purpose to it, no moral lesson built into the event, almost as if the universe itself were illustrating, cruelly and literally, the central thesis of his entire body of work. There's no bigger script organizing events, not even for the man who spent his whole life describing that absence more clearly than any other thinker of the century. What was left behind wasn't an answer. It was a method for facing the question without being destroyed by it. That is, at bottom, the quiet proposal Camus left between the lines of 2 books written in the same difficult year of a world war. Not the promise of a final answer, but the concrete possibility of continuing to walk without one, eyes open, paying attention to the weight of your own rock and the light of your own sun, without waiting for anyone's applause for doing it. Next time you feel that invisible wall separating you from someone else, in the middle of a wake, in a meeting room, at a family dinner where everyone seems to understand some rule you were never handed in writing, it might be worth remembering Meursault, sitting in the defendant's chair without justifying himself, and Sisyphus, walking down the mountain empty-handed, knowing exactly what comes next, and choosing, even so, to walk with his head held high, all the way to the base of the rock. Neither of them got a ready-made answer handed to them from outside. Both decided to keep going anyway, fully aware of the silence around them, without cheating their own doubt. And maybe that's exactly where it lives, in that simple gesture of continuing without a guaranteed answer, the one form of dignity that really depends on nobody but you. If this kind of reflection resonates with you, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and think about joining our membership club, where we go deeper into these topics with even more time and even more depth.